een warme zomer. En dan zitten we hier ergens een paar verdiepingen boven de Nieuwmarkt op een platje. Echt Amsterdams. En dan te praten met iemand die helemaal niet Amsterdams is. We praten met Jordan Zinovitz. Hij is schrijver en dichter. En hij maakt deel uit van een groep mensen die zich bezighouden met tijdelijke autonome zones. Maar Jordan Zinovitz is ook hier omdat hij op 30 juni, 1 en 2 juli in Ruigoord deelneemt aan het Dichtersfestival. En daarom vragen we hem nu om te beginnen met een gedicht. To start with a poem. Jordan, please.
Autumn is the listening time. On deserted afternoons that dawn between the rising splendor of the east and eternal western decline, withering flowers scatter at a touch. Unsteady dreams reconfigure an oppressed but obstinate earth. Recall the conspirators and their celebrated captain, whose tread crushed confused generations of jumbled, brittle leaves, whose statues now command that enigmatic hill and its surrounding marshes. Beyond a rigorous prose of fundamental vagueness, a literature of epic and legend that never adduced reality, they were not violent men. As you stand beneath the unrecoverable colors of the sky, reflect on facts. Maligned or disfigured, in life they suffer reality. Once dead, they aren't even ghosts. Ask yourself why it is that we often imagine a temporality retrieved from place, why we seldom apprehend that cause and effect is just one association of free ideas.
Well, what is sensed there that reality here and now might be different from the reality as we've learned it, as the reality that we sense from books. And in fact, your book called Gabriel Dumont in Paris opened for me the eyes to a reality I've never heard about, which is the situation in Canada around 1860s, 80s, 70s with the half-bred Indians there. Can you tell me about the idea of writing a book about that specific period in time?
It's part of a larger anarchist project that's going on right now. Not simply anarchist. It's a larger historical project where history there are lost histories. There are lost histories of the 60s. There are lost histories of the 19th century. Atona Media and Hakim Bey and myself have been doing this for now about 10 years, searching, and James Kenline from Seattle and the group in Seattle that has been so active recently, searching out histories that haven't been represented to us, that have been erased for whatever reason, and we're attempting to expand the field of history for ourselves. It's not a grand project. It's not a project that's intended to extend into conventional history. Conventional history can do what it likes as far as we're concerned, as far as I'm concerned. But this is an attempt to reclaim small sections of history that have been erased. Okay. And this man that I chose to write about was an example that George Woodcock, the great anarchist writer, chose as a prototypical anarchist community that survived until a genocidal war was waged on it. So I was interested in not so much the martyr of the movement, but the survivor of the movement, and what the permutations, the potentials that happened with him.
Let's try to picture the book. It's about half-bred, which is a mixture of French or English with the local Indians, somewhere that started in the early 19th century.
Started in the 18th century.
And they became a rather large group called Métis.
Yes, it was La Nation Métis. It was a nation. They considered themselves a nation.
Like the Indian nations.
Like an Indian nation in the sense that they spoke an Indian language, or a language of their own, not an Indian language. It was a language of a French vocabulary on a Cree grammar predominantly, so that it was a Creole language. You find the same thing with pigeons along the Chinese coast. You find the same thing with the pigeons in the slave languages in the Atlantic Basin, and they defined themselves with a syncretistic religion that was partially Catholic, partially Indian. So it was a visionary religion that also had Catholic underpinnings. Yeah. So they had over the course, they in fact started in the late 17th century. By the 18th century, they were a large group. They in fact controlled the interface between the Hudson's Bay Company fur trade and the Northwest Company, which was the French fur trade, and Europe. By the 19th century, by the time that the book that you read takes place, they had defeated the Sioux, and they were the most powerful group in central North America, the United States and Canada. It goes down as far as the Missouri River and St. Louis.
Well, for sure, that's something that I never picked up from the history books, and of course, here in Europe, our history books about Canada, and because this plays in Canada, and the states were limited. I mean, we knew about the Indians, and I knew about the buffalo. But what you have here is a historic figure where you traced some newspaper articles, books by other authors, and you take this person, Gabriel Dumont, who is like a lost hero, but he was a hero. And at the same time, for me, it feels like he was someone who was battling a lost battle that he knew he was going to lose anyway.
I think he did, yeah. I think he hoped. He hoped by the time this book was written, he hoped that there would be a mystical intervention. There would be some kind of divine intervention that would save their political movement. And
in fact, there was a figure who came with that you would call nearly biblical and religious experience as a kind of prophet who said, I can turn this around.
Yeah, he was a prophet. Louis Riel was.
Riel was. No, he's not the main figure, but he was.
He is the main figure. In fact, history regards him. They don't regard Gabriel Dumont, and Riel was a martyr, and Gabriel Dumont refused to be a martyr. And I admire Dumont's refusal. I admire his insistence that he would live and die in blood. He was not going to allow the divine to transmogrify him. He wasn't going to ascend in Claudius fashion. He was not going to ascend and become divine. He was going to sit and he was going to fight until the end. And if they killed him, they killed him, but he was going to fight.
And their fight was basically for the right of the Métis, of the half-bred people, to have their own farms, to have their own area there. And there was even a small revolution with a big fight against the Canadian authorities and the police, and people were killed. And now, is that recorded, or is that seen by the Canadians even now as an important part of their history?
It's an essential part of what defined Canada, because Canada didn't exist before 1867. 1869 was when Riel's first rebellion took place, and what the Métis were fighting for was the fact that central Canada was created by Louis Riel in 1869, 1870, and so the province of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the province of Manitoba still has a constitution that the Métis wrote. And it's a constitution, basically, it's not individualist anarchist exactly, but it's a constitution that's a radical democratic constitution. And what the Métis were fighting for was a ratification of that constitution by the Canadian government for all of central Canada. Yeah. And they lost. The Canadians, it was the English. It was a combination of the Canadian government and the English army, but they lost to a vastly superior force. But they were fighting for something that they had won through diplomatic means, not through violent means. So it was the eventual collapse of democratic action, and the closest thing to it that's going on right now is the Zapatistas movement, about which Autonomedia has also done a book, working with Marcos and people in Austin, Texas, and what the Zapatistas are going through right now is virtually exactly what the Métis went through in the in the 19th century. And also Emiliano Zapata was a Métis, was a mixed blood, and there was connection, as there is now. There was connection between the mixed blood peoples in Mexico and the United States and Canada, and regardless of the national boundaries. And that still happens. There's still a connection between with the indigenous peoples, not so much the Métis anymore, because the Métis have become the prostitutes and the drunks in most skid rows in Canadian and Western American cities.
One of the things that struck me, because you're talking about anarchists, is that seemingly there was a law, which they call the Law of the Plains, which was accepted by both the Indians and the Métis, and even by the Canadians. And it was kind of funny, because what I remember from the book, it says that if you went buffalo hunting, that everybody had to unite under the leadership of the largest group, which was intended to protect individuals from, or to protect against a situation whereby some individuals would bring the herds of the buffalo into a stampede and then lose the hunt for everybody. Now that sounded like a natural law that makes sense in that environment, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's not an anarchistic law. It's basically a law that says you have to follow the leader.
Well, anarchism, anarchism is defined, whether you want to define it individualist or not. Anarchists have to find a way to work together. If you're in a situation where the anarchists are in Washington D.C. at the World Trade Organization conference, they function as a group, regardless, and people coordinate information, people coordinate action. There is a problem in this Métis organization in defining it as anarchist, and George Woodcock discovered the problem, but I believe that it was a radical democracy. Everyone had to vote for the leader who was elected, and everybody supported that leader, and that leader could be voted out in a meeting. I mean, when you're talking about a radical democracy, or you're talking about a radical anarchist situation, anarchists, as Lenin says, they vote with their feet. If they don't like it, they leave. So it had to function, or they would leave. They wouldn't accept it. It functioned in the sense that the person who was chosen and the group that he chose to support him, the captains and their soldiers, they were all respected as hunters and as soldiers, and it was a temporary zone in much the same way.
Because it went for the hunting season?
Only for the hunting season. Then everybody went their own way. So it was only for a particular function. They came together, they functioned, they had clearly defined rules, which they voted on and discussed and changed according to what they needed at the time. Then they separated. So it's this very structured functional reality for moments in time. Then people go off and function inside their lives. They come back because during the course of that buffalo hunt, they would be supporting themselves for the rest of the year. That was the main hunt for the year. And as you describe in the book, during the lifetime of Gabriel Dumont, he saw that came to an end because they killed all the buffalo off. But when they were still doing this massive thousands and tens of thousands of buffalo hunts, that struck me very much. That if an individual broke off from the group and would go out hunting by himself, he would bring the herd of buffalo into a stampede. They would be lost for the rest of the people. So that forced them to some kind of central commands, you could call. But these were fiercely free people. Yes. So that must have been an internal struggle for them to obey this captain they appointed or they voted for during that period. Well, there must have been some kind of internal struggle, but I think there was so much excitement in the hunt. If you went out and hunted, and you're hunting on horses, you're risking your life every day. So there's so much intense commitment to every moment in those days that to have someone controlling the defense of the group and the times that the hunting happened, and he was only controlling that according to what his scouts, who they all recognized as people who were very capable, told him was the moment to hunt. to have someone take those kinds of decisions out of your hand, and for you only to have to worry about your weapons and the technologies that you're responsible for, and your horse, and and making sure your family gets fed, and then getting up the next morning and going out and doing this and risking your life, there must have been some relief in that as well. I mean, in a group situation, there are things you don't want to have to be thinking about. You don't want to have to take responsibility for everything.
Now we come to the part of the book where you write about his Gabriel Dumont. There was some historical evidence about his existence and what happened and the whole situation, some newspaper clippings. But like a hunt, what you describe now was what also came to me. Man, this must have been exciting times. But did you ever hunt yourself?
Buffalo? Yes, yeah. I hunt. I'm not buffalo, I don't hunt, but I hunt.
But, yeah.
I hunt deer, I hunt elk, I hunt...
So you wrote that from the experience of doing it?
Partly, yeah. I also wrote it from archival research. Gabriel Dumont had left oral histories, and his wife was literate. So there's a fairly extensive record that nobody but George Woodcock had ever explored. Now, George Woodcock had an axe to grind. He wanted to prove that there were anarchist potentials in various kinds of social situations. I didn't try to extend that. I'll let his analysis stand. My concern is with how one man would function. First of all, in learning how to become a complete person in a situation that is so exciting, would mature into a man, would begin to develop relationships, and then would how he would respond to watching everything that he valued be destroyed, and what kind of strengths that would display. That was what was of interest to me.
Yes, but is there an identification there? Do you see yourself as Gabriel Dumont?
No, I don't.
Half crazy, half fierce, half confirming.
Well, I think
pioneer.
Well, that's awful. You went all over the place on that question.
Well, I'm trying to see this person there. That in that book, as you say, there was a time that he was married and happily building up his estate along the river. And then, for some reason, comes this war. The Canadian government decides that they want to send new settlers in that take their settlements for some stupid law, a few dollars that they refuse to pay. And then a whole, well, you could say war develops, in which he becomes the leader. And from your book, I get the impression he didn't even want to be the leader.
Well, he was the leader from the time he was 24. He was the leader of that group. It's a much more cynical scenario. Canada wanted the Métis eradicated. They needed a war because they needed to finance a railroad. They needed part of the Articles of Confederation demanded that British Columbia be linked with the East, with Ottawa, Ontario, Quebec. So they needed something that would bring an influx of capital to build a railroad to link the East and the West of Canada. The war was an excuse to hurry up the completion of the railroad. So these people were sacrificed for the purposes of nation building in the grand colonial era, which is the 19th century, 18th, 19th century for England.
Has the world changed there?
Oh, well, I don't think so.
We're still...
I think that
Chechnya, the Balkan, the same situation still happens.
Yeah, well...
nations have a different plans that are not necessarily aligned with the interest of the people they pretend to defend.
Yes, exactly, sure. Yeah, it hasn't changed at all. Yeah. I mean, one thing about working with history as opposed to working with the Balkans, and we've been, for the past 2 years, Hans Plomp may have told you, last year in our conference in New York, we invited some Serbian dissident artists to come out, and we could not get them out because they were bombing Belgrade, but we got them out this year. The situations that develop have, I've kind of lost the train of thought. They have nothing to do with the people who were involved, nothing to do with small people who live from day to day. They have everything to do with large forces that are making every effort to have those people function in ways that they want them to do. They want a kind of predictability from people that they can never get, so they kind of try to force a predictability on those people. Now, one of the things about working with history, as opposed to working with Miro and working with the Balkans, the people we have in the Balkans, is that I can step back a little bit and I can invest some of myself in that. I can invest some of my own ideals and my own illusions in it, and I can create something that seems satisfying to me. And whether it's true to any reality other than what I want it to be or not is not an issue to me.
Yeah. But
really.
is that counter history? Is that opposing the history, as you said in your poem, that looks down from the statues with the dead men that we are supposed to admire? But we have that in Amsterdam. We have, big statues of Van Huyts, for instance. People that we know now were kind of slaughtering off parts of the Indonesian population. When I was young, I thought this was a hero. Now we don't see them as a hero. And what you're doing is in fact digging up the unsung heroes.
Yeah, in the complex mythology of heroes, I think that there are heroes. I think there are people who stand up for a moment and place themselves in situations that are very much putting themselves at risk, and whether they succeed or they don't succeed, they've done that. And we're not talking about heroes as defined by national governments or anything else, or even grand literary figures like Walter Scott or someone with Ivanhoe or whoever. I'm just picking names out of the air, but I suppose I'm picked that because of the courtliness of the English version and my view of the courtliness of Gabriel Dumont. But I think that there are heroes that are heroes for people, and I think they have little or nothing to do with heroes that are projected upon you from outside. They're heroes that become very personal and that you can use to inform actions in your own life, I think. And I search for those kinds of heroes, those kinds of situations all the time. Marcos is a complicated figure, and
when you take a how do you say an enlarging glass? How do you call that? A vergrootglas, a magnifying glass, and looking at a little bit of half-forgotten history. Do you find that that it changes your view on the whole history?
I try, when I'm looking that closely at history, I try very much to remember that people are human, so that I try not to go into history and assume that I have the answers. I try to look at them and see where they might have failures and flaws. I try to look at their lives, recognize where the passion is and how the passion plays out in their lives, but also recognize where they may have made mistakes, because I certainly feel that I'm more than capable of making mistakes.
There are no saints.
That's right. I do not believe in saints. And so from that perspective, then, recognizing the kinds of flaws in characters, then I love to look as closely as I can, warts and all, history warts and all. I think that Gabriel Dumont had some serious failures, and yet he was admirable in so many ways. And I look at, I've been doing history now for 16 years. Hard histories and novel histories and survey of art and history for Semiotext of the radical politics of Canada, and poetry about history, and I'm very interested in what undercurrents we allow to influence us in our daily living, and when I find that there's a little edge on one of those undercurrents and it tears some skin off one of my fingers when I'm kind of caressing it, then I look at what's torn the skin off and then see what happens. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not so successful. But for me, it's always fascinating.
You describe it as some kind of archaeology, as digging in the ground, really, and finding things.
Yeah, I suppose it's excavating in my mind. You know, I've got all kinds of little iron.
Does it come from your background? Because this book was about Canada. You live in New York, but you're Russian.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
How did you get out of Russia?
My family came out of Russia. It was Pripyat, south of Kiev, which is the swamp where when the Varangian Vikings went in and started slaving in Kiev and established Kiev, people fled to.
We're talking about the Black Sea area,
no, we're talking north of the Black Sea area on the Danube River, and there have been heretical sects there, the Doukhobors, the spirit wrestling, visionary, communal, Adamite, sexual freedom people have been there, and there's been a tremendous number of people move into these areas because they've never been invaded. The armies can't go into them, and so my family came from there to Canada, and then I moved to New York. And so I had to preserve something that wasn't American, you know, the great empire, the evil empire. You've got to find a defense against the evil empire. Everyone has to find some kind of protection. So,
but are you saying,
that's why I continue to write about Canada. Yeah, besides which, I understand it.
Is Canada more understandable than the States?
Well, it depends on how I engage the States. You know, if I engage the States in terms of pop culture and computer technology and whatnot, then Canada is a small player. But if I engage the United States in something that's emotionally meaningful to me, then it's easier for me to understand Canada. I can get emotional charges from various connections that I've had in technological environments, for example, or in the technological movements of the moment. But I find that ultimately, even though, you know, the extropians or the cypherpunks or whoever I'm dealing with, they all end up having to deal with their own emotions. Ultimately, they have to deal with themselves.
Yeah, but
I mean, the technology breaks down. The technology doesn't protect them from themselves. And so I look for places that protect, if not protect me, at least allow me to create enough instruments that I can engage in those larger debates with kinds of filters that make sense to me.
Okay, well, let's take this line of thinking, because I know the extra people who are going into nanotechnology and really see technology as the way out and forward. I sometimes have the feeling, you have it now with the hype on the internet, the whole .com craziness, that Americans see technology as a weapon, as really a hunting weapon to go out and conquer the world. Do you think Canadians and maybe even Russians are different in that respect, that we don't use technology as a defense weapon or even an attack weapon?
I think if you look at the large movements of empires, you can easily look at, North America that way, that technologies are weapons. I think also, though, that there is a deep idealistic underpinning there where they believe it's almost a social Darwinist, social evolutionary position that the technology is going to provide enough so that everybody is going to benefit, but they are going to impose the technology on the world. And I think that idealism is also to be considered when you're talking about the United States or North American technological attitudes. And it's not simply North American, of course, but when you're talking about technology as weapons, I think you have to try and understand the ideologies that are driving the weapon users. And if there's sometimes they honestly believe that there's a moral underpinning to their flailing with weapons and then
the police role in Serbia.
Sure, and then or the Gulf War with the smart weapons, and here we're going to do surgical strikes. We'll take out the bad guys and leave the good guys. And then the neutron bomb is the extension of that. Then we'll take out everybody and save the property. But let's not go there.
No, but the funny thing is that at the same time they develop these powerful weapons, and I'm not only talking about cruise missiles and stuff, but also about the internet and stuff. And then it seems that, for instance, Serbia, they got 14 tanks in the end or something like that with 30,000 sorties. They only got 14 tanks down. And you see the same thing. And for the internet, some little kids out there in, where was it? It was in Asia, where was it? The Philippines, come with an I love you virus, which takes the whole
them down. Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't think that the strategies of the smart bombs have changed so radically. I think that what you're talking about is Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. If we want to get into the most nefarious view, the ugliest view of the United States, you're talking about bombing Serbia into the Stone Age, bombing Serbia to the point where it rejects its so-called elected leaders, whether Milosevic is what they want or who they want, or whether America drove Milosevic into their arms is an entirely different question. But when you're talking about bombing,
yeah, but that's a belief.
No, we're talking about now. We go to the internet,
yeah,
and you can still have interventions on small scale by people who either don't know or don't care what effect they're going to have. They might just simply want to see what's going to happen when they send these little viruses out. And it's a different kind of strike. I think you can look at what the people did in Indonesia with the I love you virus, and you can look at what happened.
It was the Philippines, but
Philippines. Regardless of where it is, and it's not something that I've followed particularly closely. But I have followed what's been going on in Seattle and Washington, D.C. with the anarchist movements. And it's one thing to mobilize, to have people playing with a kind of virus and insert it and watch what happens as the networks crash. It's another thing to actually put people on the line and risk themselves. And I think that there's a this may go back to the question about Gabriel Dumont. I guess I'm interested in nobility. I'm interested in whether people feel honestly about their positioning and whether they're prepared to risk something of themselves rather than simply take a technology and insert it in and watch all of the technologies collapse and believe, like insurance fraud sometimes, that it has no effect on them. I'm much more interested in people who are willing to take risks than people who are willing to play.
So you're interested in champions. Do we have... I mean, we had Gabriel Dumont. Now we have Bill Gates, who no doubt sees himself as a champion for the free enterprise and whatever, Microsoft. But do we have... Where have the champions gone?
I'm not so interested in champions. I'm interested in the capability of everyone to rise for themselves, for whatever reason, to the level of champion temporarily. And to function with other people as equals once they get to that level. In other words, I'm interested in a kind of larger notion of nobility that includes other people and that doesn't involve a kind of dominant voice, but it enables people to feel complete in some way. So I didn't answer your question. But I posed a different.
Pose a different. But then again, what in this world can we do to help people to get it? Well, maybe you can call it pride or a sense of championship or the need to rise. How can we stimulate people to stand up? Because what I feel in this new 21st century is that people say, "Oh, we're wealthy, we're rich." Economic things is we're willing to risk some money on the stock market, but that's about it.
Yeah.
They don't care about the environment anymore, I have a feeling.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. I think the people that I work most closely with are people who feel that they've been disenfranchised, feel that they don't have money to risk on the stock market. They don't have homes, some of them. They don't have this, they don't have that. And for brief periods in time, they come together and they make a statement. The people who have so much, I guess partly that's the reason that I wrote the novel. I mean, you can have, by couching it in terms of fiction, by taking history and making it fiction, even though it's very, very close to the history, and the historians don't like it for all kinds of reasons, but some of them admire it. By taking history and offering it in a public forum, you can provide this kind of almost facile, stereotypical heroes, and this happens in virtual realities too. You provide these situations, and then you have people like Inez van de Spek, and Catherine Richards, who then say, okay, this is a virtual environment, but we're going to invest it with women's issues. So you can provide these situations that seem transparent, but aren't transparent because they have different underpinnings. And so the excitement that they generate can grasp somebody who is enfranchised, is fairly comfortable. They can grasp that person with a question: why is this not quite what I anticipate it's going to be? And then things start to happen, because if you start anyone thinking, they'll begin to play.
Yeah. When I read the book, I thought it's inspirational. It shows you that first, you don't have to be a saint to be a hero, to stand up at the time you're asked, and that you describe it in such a way. It's in a way it's so little, so small, so limited. This guy lives there and he built his house, and you describe exactly how many rooms there were and the little buildings. That becomes very touchable.
Yeah.
And then yet there is this feeling, yes, but this guy still did play, and this Riel, this other guy, played a role in Canadian history and thereby in our history.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a question now with the grand movements, the internet and technologies, and comfort, especially in the West. You can't speak of comfort in terms of Indonesian Nike shops or Africa or the Zapatistas being forced to accept the corn seed, the biologically engineered corn seed, and being refused the ability to just grow corn and replant their own corn the next year. That's not allowed anymore because of NAFTA and the free trade agreement.
You're touching on something that most people don't know here. What happened in the States is that they have genetically manipulated corn, which doesn't which doesn't reproduce yourself. It means that as a farmer, you could plant corn or potatoes or whatever, and then you would be sure that if you take the seeds and plant them next year, you would have corn again.
Yeah.
But now they have seeds that don't reproduce, so you can put them in the earth for 1 year and you get a crop, but the next year there's nothing there. Which means that if your supplier, Monsanto or the big companies, stop supplying you would die.
Archer Daniels Midlands or whoever.
Yeah.
You're and because of the agreements made in North America, we're losing the light. Because of the agreements made in North America, that's part of what the Zapatistas are fighting about, to have the right to grow their own crops next year. And it wasn't so different from the Métis. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are all of these small issues. They come down to individual people, and it's how certain people respond to those that becomes inspirational. The inspiration is in how people who feel deeply and are intelligent and try to be fair in all kinds of ways respond to a situation that is completely paradoxical and totally unacceptable. And that's an essential part of living for all of us, and it's very much what interests me about history and very much what interests me about Gabriel Dumont. So,
okay, well, we're losing the light because even in the summer, it gets a little bit darker and we're sitting outside. Jordan, thank you for explaining this. En ik zal het even in het Nederlands afronden. Dat boek van Jordan gaat over Gabriel Dumont. Dat was dus een halfbloed in Canada die opstond tegen het Canadese gezag. En eigenlijk een stukje geschiedenis wat wij hier nauwelijks kennen. Maar wat dus schijnbaar heel belangrijk was. Maar de manier waarop hij dat boek geschreven heeft zijn door allerlei details, historische details en zijn eigen ervaring met bijvoorbeeld de jacht daarin te brengen, krijg je echt een soort identificatie met die Gabriel Dumont. En dat was geen aardige man. Dat was ook wel een man die dronk en dat had zijn fouten. Maar op het moment dat hij nodig was in die opstand tegen de Canadese regering, deed hij zijn werk. En dat alles bij elkaar is een heel aardig boek, maar er is meer. Want Jordan en een aantal andere dichters en schrijvers en denkers zijn op 30 juni, 1 juli en 2 juli in Ruigoord voor een dichters event. Dat heet Het Woord in Ruigoord. En iedereen is daar van harte welkom om ook met dit soort mensen, Ira Cohen, een van de Beat Generation dichters, is ook daar om met dit soort mensen te praten en van gedachten te wisselen en te luisteren naar hun gedichten en hun gedachten. Thank you.
Thank you.